Okay, hello everybody. Actually recording this one from school today. Not quite the same without my dog Murdoch, but we'll give it a shot. This is chapter 14, Forging the National Economy, 1790 to 1860. A couple of key points here with the market revolution. First of all, this will drastically change the way people live their life. It literally sets the United States on an economic course that is more in line with the way things are run today. And that economic course will actually have social ramifications as well. It also creates stronger bonds between individuals where they may have been isolated previously. Now there is this market where goods are being brought to and purchased from, and therefore there's an interdependence between them. The transformation that occurs includes several things. It's a modernization of technology, including communication and transportation, which leads to the expansion of the economy and economic growth in general. Folks, again, are moving towards factory work as opposed to living on semi-subsistence farms, and they therefore become dependent upon wages and lose the land to fall back on. This is really the end of the ideal Jeffersonian republic of subsistence farmers. So what exactly were people in the West like? Well, they are a special sort of folk, to say the least. They are self-reliant to a large extent, right? They are virtually isolated. They have nobody but themselves to fall back on. They are becoming increasingly diverse, which I think is a neat thing to see, the changing demographics in the West. Immigrants, particularly Germans, right, in the West are going to be settling on farms. And from there you have this sort of rugged individualism that goes along with this agrarian lifestyle. And people are in charge of their own destiny. They have the land to fall back on. They are producing food and materials for themselves and operating as a basic unit of society. It's a young, energetic republic. And the center of the population is actually shifting westward constantly, as you see from this map right here. But again, it's like this westward charge and the emergence of a true national character. Let's not forget that popular politics actually exploited this image of the West. Here is Andrew Jackson, right? The first Western president, the embodiment of this rugged individualistic spirit. And while his critics, the Whigs, actually called him King Jackson I, they later, in 1840, used the same kind of frontier, rugged campaign to put William Henry Harrison in office over Martin Van Buren. And so the westward movement also molded the physical environment, and the pageant talks about ecological imperialism, which in a nutshell is sort of the exploitation of natural resources. And we're talking about things like land and furs and hides and so forth, but it seems as though people were consuming these without any real foresight or concern for consequences down the road. So as we talked about tobacco and soil butchery in the earlier chapters of the pageant, now we're going to see the decimation of beaver. Sea otters are impacted by this as well. And obviously buffalo, as buffalo robes come into vogue, there's a real demand for those products, and therefore that has a pretty bad impact on the buffalo population in the West. Now, at the same time, there is a realization of the beauty of the American landscape, and I think that anybody who's been to the West can attest to its size and natural beauty. I mean, it's just breathtaking to see. And the pageant refers to this as a national mystique that inspired literature and painting. So just a couple images of the American landscape, the first of which is the view from Mount Holyoke by Thomas Cole, and the second, Among the Sierra Nevada Mountains by Albert Bierstadt. These are both done by the Hudson River School, an organization known for celebrating American landscapes. So population growth throughout this time is very rapid. In fact, by 1860, there are now 33 states in the Union. Don't forget that admittance to the Union was based on population, as per the Northwest Ordinance. And now the United States is the fourth most populous nation in the Western world, behind Russia, France, and Austria. As a side note, we're experiencing urbanization. There are 43 cities in 1860 that can claim to have a population of 20,000 people or more. And so I realize it's difficult to read the years down the left side of this, but this is a photo, page 279 from the American Pageant. And you can see that from the days of Washington to the days of Jackson, the population has tripled. Obviously, we're living at a time where there's a lot of hysteria related to immigration. And I always try to tell my students that this anti-immigrant sentiment has less to do with the specifics of the people who are coming and more to do with the fact that they're coming at this particular time. And so we're going to see a large wave of Irish immigration beginning in the 1840s and 1850s for a variety of reasons. First of all, understand that the United States did have this feeling of the land of freedom and opportunity, and that there was an abundance of land in the U.S., and there was also problems back home in Ireland, the biggest of which, of course, is the potato famine. And so while many Irish who come here are not able to purchase this abundant land in the West, they come in large numbers for opportunities, primarily in cities, and work at factory jobs and jobs in manual labor and so forth. And there is a real resentment towards this. And so urban Irish laborers looking for work will often see the sign, "No Irish need apply," or just shortened to NINA down the road. But they are going to be working on building a lot of the infrastructure that, in fact, is driving the market revolution. They're building canals and building railroads and so forth. They are entering into the bottom rung of American society, and therefore are accused by, quote, Native Americans, as in native-born Americans, of stealing their jobs. Now, in cities, they do become a powerful political force. They get involved in patronage. They also are going to be largely in control of police force in places like New York City, and they are, in fact, the largest group of immigrants from 1830 to the Civil War, and therefore do face a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, as I already said. The second largest immigrant group in the United States at this time were German Americans. In fact, from 1830 to 1860, 1.5 million German immigrants came to this country. Many of them had a modest amount of money and therefore were able to move west and purchase land and farm their own land. And so we start to see more Germans on the frontier than we do in the cities as the Irish had settled. The pageant tells us that German influence was more cultural than political. They valued things like education. In fact, introduced kindergarten in this country. And they were also enemies to slavery in the early years, or the years leading up to the Civil War, excuse me. They also sometimes isolated themselves from non-German communities, and that raised some suspicion amongst non-Germans, and sort of added to the general fear of immigrants that probably existed already. Just to show you this table from our textbook, you can see that the largest years of immigration for each the Irish and the Germans were 1851 to 1860 for the Irish, and 1881 to 1890 for the Germans. And so, to the point that I made earlier, I would guess that these are the 2 decades in which anti-Irish and anti-German sentiment was at its peak. Okay, so again, I'll use that phrase nativism, which is just sort of native-born Americans and their general fear and hatred of outsiders and foreigners. And to be brief, I think that in some ways they make an argument that immigration is sort of affecting the purity of America. And obviously, I think that's just rubbish. But in this case, was attacked quite heavily was the Catholic faith of the Irish and, of course, of a German minority as well. There was actual violence that took place in Philadelphia and Boston, with churches and convents being burned, and a political party which was basically rooted in nativism. They called themselves the Know-Nothing Party because when asked about it, they said they knew nothing of it. But I think officially they were the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Again, so it's this like super nationalistic, anti-foreign sentiment that is, I guess, uniting and rallying people in this country. Ultimately, though, immigrants become an integral part of the Industrial Revolution, and had it not been for this economic expansion, we can guess that violence and anti-immigrant sentiment would have been even stronger than it was. And so it takes time for industrialization to reach the United States. Obviously, we need a labor supply, and immigrants will increasingly become that supply of labor. And if they had money when they arrived here, as I said before, they went west and bought land and farmed it. I mean, why not? And capital from abroad would greatly help this as well, but capital investment was contingent upon the source of labor, as well as secure property rights, sufficient infrastructure, and political stability, all of which you could say were works in progress in the early 1800s in America. Let's talk now about a significant impact on the cotton industry and, as a result, the institution of slavery. So Sam Slater in 1791 had memorized plans for a spinning wheel and actually came to the United States and rebuilt that. It seems as though mercantilist policy had prevented the exportation of machines. Way to go, English. And Eli Whitney and his cotton gin made just the production of cotton far more profitable. What it did was it allowed one person to quickly separate the seed from the raw cotton. So if the raw cotton is much cheaper to produce, then it therefore can be sold and used, and demand will go up and so forth. And so slavery was actually in decline prior to this, but the introduction of the cotton gin will kind of revive the institution. So here's that cotton gin. It's manually operated by turning that crank. One can quickly separate the seed from the fiber. And people who know me know that I like things mechanical, just interesting to me. Clearly, it was effective, as by 1860, over 400 million pounds of southern cotton made its way to the mills, most of which were in New England. But it also had a larger impact, as I referenced earlier, in sort of reviving the institution of slavery. I wonder if we'll ever know the actual impact of what this piece of technology has had on our world. Post-war of 1812, British goods are back again in competition with American goods. Several things will happen which will give the American industry a bit of an upper hand, the first of which might have been Eli Whitney's standardized parts. So parts are now standardized and therefore interchangeable. That helps with production and repairs. Also, the Singer sewing machine was developed, which will become the foundation of the ready-made clothing industry, which employs a great deal of people, many of them women, in New England. The principle of limited liability is born at this time, and it was the Boston Associates, one of the first companies to actually use this strategy quite effectively. They came to dominate the railroad, textile, insurance, and banking industries. And in fact, states now will make it easier for corporations to be formed, such as New York in 1848 with their free corporation laws. Limited liability, by the way, is a concept which says that you are only responsible for the money you have invested. So should the company that you are a part of goes bankrupt, the bank can't come after your personal assets. One last bit of technology here is Samuel Morse. He invents, of course, Morse code, which in 1844 he connected D.C. and Baltimore, typed out the message, "What hath God brought?" He actually had received money from Congress, $30,000 to develop this, but in a sense he drastically shrinks the world and provides instant communication. That's going to revolutionize news gathering, diplomacy, and finance, Snapchat. And by the way, here is a message for you APUSH folks, and the first one to tell me what it is tomorrow in class receives whatever kind of candy they have in the office. Obviously, industrial work is vastly different from agricultural work, but we should also realize that industrialization reduced the value of labor. You don't have an artisan who's working on one project from start to finish. You may have several people who are working on smaller, more remedial parts of the project, and therefore they may start to question whether or not they're actually connected to their work. They may not necessarily care about the quality of their work. It's the wage they need, and the wage is really reflective of the time they spent at the factory. So the clock is in charge, as opposed to some sort of intrinsic motivation to do a good job. So let's talk more about labor's struggle while on the clock. Well, they have long hours and poor conditions and probably low wages, right? They're also denied the right to form unions. Children are being exploited, and the text tells us that they are physically and emotionally abused, whipped in the whipping rooms and so forth. I try to tell my students that child laborers of the 19th century essentially reach adulthood by age 10. Now, in the court case Commonwealth v. Hunt, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts will rule that labor unions were not illegal conspiracies, provided that their methods were honorable and peaceful. And so this paves the way for labor unions throughout the rest of the century. Not to say that labor unions don't have a tough road ahead, but it kind of opens the door for their existence and eventually for their contribution. And so gender roles are impacted by the market revolution as well, and you can see that in the story of the New England girls. These are the daughters of New England farmers who, for a period of 1 to 3 years, went to work in these textile factories. During that time, by the way, they were heavily supervised. They were escorted from work to church and back to the company town, and at the end of the day, they were still expected to settle down and marry, and probably genuinely subscribe to this cult of domesticity. So this widespread cultural creed that glorified the customary function of the homemaker, it is somewhat restrictive of a role, obviously, but it does say, and it reminds me of at least this Republican motherhood that we talked about in the 1700s, where women had a real role within the family, within the home, in shaping character and the morals of the family, and I think that is significant. And so the family in general is changing, and people begin to choose a spouse based on love as opposed to some sort of prearranged marriage. Families are growing smaller, and keep in mind that this is a time where birth control is still considered taboo for polite conversation, yet the birth rate is down. As families are smaller, they tend to become more centered around the children. Not to say that parents wanted to spoil their children, but they did spare the rod, so to say. They did prefer to shape a child's will rather than simply break it. And perhaps this is sort of indicative of what some were calling domestic feminism, that reference to the growing power and independence that women had. It's not necessarily a modern family per se, but it's a significant change nonetheless. Okay, major agricultural changes in the West are taking place. First of all, the text tells us that people are increasingly planting corn. It's very versatile. It's a grain. It also could be fed to hogs and could also be distilled into whiskey. In fact, people start to produce this on a large scale, and two inventions help that. First of all, the steel plow by John Deere allows farmers to cut through the hardy root structures in the West, and it's also lighter, so it can be pulled by horse as opposed to oxen. But it's the McCormick mechanical reaper that really made large-scale production not just possible, but profitable. And as you can see here, one man, while sitting down, could do the same amount of work that five would have done prior to this with sickles. And so this leads farmers to start producing grain for the market as opposed just for themselves. And in order to do that, they begin buying more land and machinery, which unfortunately leads to more debt for them. Here's a photo of some nice fellows pedaling these John Deere plows, as well as a picture of a man on a reaper. It's kind of hard to see, so you can see in this model here basically how it works. Does not look very happy today. Okay, how about some highways and steamboats? The Lancaster Turnpike in Pennsylvania was completed in the 1790s by a private company. It was hard service. The drivers had to pay a toll. In fact, when they got in the toll booth, the pikes there were turned away once the toll was paid, hence the name Turnpike. It was highly successful and returned 15% to its investors. In 1811, construction began on the Cumberland Road, which linked Maryland and Vandalia, Illinois. It was finished in 1839. At the same time, there's a steamboat craze that's going on, and Robert Fulton is the first to put a steam engine on a boat, and that demonstrated its potential in 1807 on the Hudson River. And what it does is it actually turns all rivers and streams into two-way roads. Fulton actually made it 150 miles in 32 hours. That's a whopping 4.7 miles per hour. Also, population clusters will emerge along these rivers, and raw materials can now be brought back and forth, as well as finished goods. I thought you might like to see this advertisement for the Hope and Perseverance, two interestingly named steamboats that traveled from Albany to New York City, as you can see here. Perhaps that really reflects the time, or maybe just marketing genius. A true engineering marvel in its day, the Erie Canal will link the Great Lakes with the Hudson River. This is pushed forward by Governor DeWitt Clinton. It began in 1817, was completed in 1825, and it was 363 miles long. It greatly reduced the cost of shipping. As you can see here, 1 ton of grain from Buffalo to New York City fell from $100 to $5, and the amount of time was cut significantly as well. This also increased the value of land along this region. It allowed new cities like Rochester and Syracuse to pop up and in fact blossom, and it closely links the Old Northwest with the East. And here is a map of that canal route. Okay, and the railroad, which obviously holds a special place in America's heart. It's fast, it's reliable, it's cheaper to build than canals, it's not going to freeze in the wintertime. You can basically build it anywhere you'd like to, for the most part. And you would think that it would be widely embraced. Actually, there was quite some opposition, I think particularly amongst folks who were invested into the canal building industry. And there's other problems with it as well. In 1828, for example, different railroads might have different sized track, as in the width between the track would be a different gauge, as they would say. The brakes are also not all that reliable. But certainly this is going to usher in a whole new level of economic growth. And as you see here, by 1860, the United States had roughly 30,000 miles of track, most of which, 75% of which, was located in the Northeast. Keeping in line with linking communities, in 1858, the first transatlantic cable was laid across the pond. In 1866, a second and better cable was laid, as the first one died very quickly. In 1819, a pioneering American steamer vessel, the Savannah, made it across the Atlantic Ocean, but it was the Yankee clipper ships that ruled the golden age of American shipping. They were longer, they had many sails, they were very fast. Donald McKay's Boston shipyard is credited with building many of these. Now, they couldn't carry as much cargo, but they could outrun a steamer. Eventually, these are beaten by the British steamers, the so-called tea kettles, which were steadier, roomier, reliable, and therefore more profitable. Pony Express was established in 1860 to carry mail from Missouri to Sacramento. Stations were placed roughly 10 miles apart, so a rider could get on his horse and ride 10 miles, and then get onto another fresh horse and ride another 10 miles. And in fact, one could get from Sacramento to Missouri in roughly 10 days. So all of these changes are obviously beneficial to the country and the economy as a whole, but we definitely see a shift here. For example, the Mississippi River is less important in terms of transporting goods, and in fact, New York City emerges as the seaboard queen of the nation. And so, just to summarize and get back to the point of the market revolution, understand that more and more people are being linked together in their economic fate into this new market economy. The self-sufficient households of colonial days have been transformed. The folks are not just providing for themselves. In fact, they're providing for market, and they're purchasing finished goods that they used to make for themselves. Now, with this comes a sort of dependence upon wages for many, and kind of a shift towards industrial labor down the road, and that does illustrate a widened gap between the rich and the poor. That said, Americans at this time seem to be, kind of embracing this change with a sense of boundlessness that one can do anything, and that the opportunities are limitless. Okay, for more discussion on the market revolution, there's a short video linked here by Eric Foner, a highly distinguished professor of history from Columbia University. Some consider him to be the expert on Reconstruction, so enjoy. Okay, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments or just email me. And as always, like and subscribe. Have a good night.